Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Friday, 25th of May, 2018. And yep, I'm sitting down. And before anybody asks, I'm absolutely fine. The last time I sat down for a broadcast, I got a bunch of messages asking if I was okay. Well, believe it or not, I do occasionally sit down. And today, the broadcast is titled The Death Throes of Fracking. Now, the tragedy is, of course, that this industry doesn't realize that it's dead, if not yet buried. And as with anything that realizes that subconsciously that it is probably at the end of its life, then it will do everything it possibly can to try to resist the inevitable. And that's exactly what is occurring here. So, 5.5 years after the moratorium was lifted on this abomination, the industry has yet to fire up the frack pumps more than once. And I think that, the evidence would certainly suggest that Rathin Energy were running the mini frack, the defit test, when they lost control of the well. So that's the only time the frack pumps have been fired up in anger since April 2000 or May 2011. So that's, in fact, it's almost exactly 7 years. On the 27th, so on Sunday, it will be the 7th year anniversary of the second significant seismic event at Priest Hall, triggered by none other than Quadrilla, the same cowboy outfit that has submitted an application to Greg Clark to frack its horizontal well at Preston New Road. Now, Quadrilla are not making the same mistake as Third Energy. They're not going to be so arrogant and bring their kit on prior to the permission, it would seem. They are going to wait until Greg Clark actually gives that permission. And of course, they're also going to wait until they get their injunction in place. Well, needless to say, there's going to be a lot of opposition. And already, Greg Clark has been served notice that once again, for the second time in 6 months, his political future is once again on the line. Because once Quadrilla fire up the pumps, and all eyes are going to be on them if Greg Clark gives that permission, and when Quadrilla screw it up, which they are most likely going to do, then it will be very much on the shoulders of Greg Clark, because the evidence is there. And of course, just recently with the report submitted and presented by Professor Peter Stiles, where he has shown the proximity of all the old coal workings to the Boland Shale. Not that this is, anything revelationary, but Professor Stiles has pulled it all together and presented it in the committee rooms of the House of Lords, and it is now in the Parliamentary Library. So it is undeniable, Mr. Clark, that you have this information at your fingertips. And of course, if it's just a seismic event, well, that's bad enough. But if, as is also quite probably the case, there will be contamination at some point, then it will fall very much on your shoulders. And there will be many, many people who will not forget that it was Greg Clark who signed this off, despite the opposition from people all around the country, and in particular the people of the Fyle Peninsula, and despite the plethora of evidence that is in the public domain. Then it will be down to him, and he will be forever associated with whatever transpires after this frack job. And even if, in the unlikely event that there is no immediate reaction here, then something will manifest down the road. And of course, in the meantime, the likelihood is that there may be other companies, particularly INEOS and iGas, who also make applications to frack in different parts of the Boland Shale, increasing exponentially the risk of seismic events and of contamination. And as we've seen in Australia, where the industry went hell for leather to establish a network of coal bed methane fracked gas wells in 2006, it was 2 years before the magnitude of the problem became apparent. And by that time, the industry is going, oh, well, ain't it a shame? But we're just going to keep trucking on. And, you know, of course, in southern Queensland, the population density is a lot less than it is here in the UK. So they can simply buy people off, which is, of course, what Rathlin Energy have tried to do following their triggering of minor surface seismic activity when they were conducting their seismic testing in December 2014, where Rathlin Energy effectively paid one landowner for the damage that they had caused to his holiday properties. In fact, the land manager of that particular estate told me personally that he considered that Rathlin was being a good neighbour by accepting their responsibility and paying for the repairs to be done. But of course, Rathlin wasn't such a good neighbour to Anthony Scott and his family business, the fishing lake and fish farm in Whiten. And to this day, Rathlin Energy are still refusing, despite initially acknowledging that they were responsible, they are still refusing to settle, and the legal case is dragging out. And of course, it's in the government's interest to make sure that this gets dragged out and doesn't get into the public domain for as long as possible. Just like the court case of the Third Energy driver, well, he's a Third Energy employee, but he was driving at the time, who deliberately tried to run a protector off his bike and knocked him into the hedgerow. And a court case that was scheduled in Northallerton for late March was, well, it wasn't even adjourned, it was pushed back on the basis of the court had run out of time on that day. So it was originally pushed back to next Wednesday, May the 30th. Then that was changed to a case management hearing. Then it was changed to the full hearing, and now it's been postponed once again. And of course, it's in the government and the industry's interests to push these cases back, because ostensibly this is the prima facie evidence that the industry will effectively do what it takes to ride roughshod over the opposition. And as we saw at Tinker Lane last Friday, one of the iGas, I believe it was a security, but not 100% sure, but he literally tried to drive through the protectors at the gate, which was a big mistake, because he was then held up for a couple of hours at least while the police managed to muster some resources to come and take a look at the situation, only to discover, of course, that he was driving with a ripped tyre, and he was only allowed to go on his way once he'd changed the wheel. But the reality is that the opposition is mounting exponentially. The industry is desperate. And there are elements within the government that are desperate because they don't want to admit that they've screwed up. They don't want to admit that David Cameron and George Osborne were seduced by Lord John Brown, who's ridden off into the sunset now. But they didn't want to admit that basically this agenda was a non-starter from the get-go. They actually believed that the British public was so dumbed down that actually, you know, there might be a few crazies that oppose this, but, you know, we can deal with them just like we've dealt with them before. What they didn't realise was that communities right across the country would do their own research and come to their own realisation and participate in the process of opposing this industry. which they have done in enormous numbers. At a conservative estimate, there's about 1,000 groups around the country, formal, informal, and then there's individuals such as myself who are not aligned with any group, who simply do what we do. And in my case, it's simply to try to stimulate people's curiosity so that they will look at this for themselves. And as I've repeated ad nauseum, you will never, ever hear the government or the industry ask you to do your own research. They know that once people do look at this for themselves, they will very quickly realize what a nightmare they would be unleashing beneath their communities. So part of the death throes, of course, is to get injunctions against the active protectors. And, this is a long way from, the era of 5-6 years ago when, the government was saying, well, of course, we're not going to do this unless we get social license, which basically means, of course, that, we're not going to do this until such time as we've got the general public in such a state of stasis that, they're not going to do anything. They're just going to sit back and let it happen. Wrong. That ain't going to happen. The industry knows it isn't going to happen. The government knows it's not going to happen. So elements within the government, elements within the police have colluded with this industry to put the proposition forward that the way to quell the opposition is to get injunctions. And of course, this is an attempt to establish a raft of supra-parliamentary legislation which threatens those people who have the audacity to want to protect the ecology, to protect the quality of the water. One might argue that it's already not what it should be, but to protect the quality of the water for future generations. So let's get an injunction. Let's threaten them with loss of their possessions or loss of their liberty. Well, that is going to backfire spectacularly, even if the injunctions are granted. And yesterday, of course, Joe Boyd and Joe Corey got permission from the Court of Appeal to appeal against Justice Morgan's ruling on the INEOS application for an injunction. And of course, the INEOS injunction initially not only wanted to stop active opposition, it wanted to shut down any criticism or any negative comment which they perceived might have had a negative impact on their business. I mean, you couldn't make this up. It's about as Orwellian and dystopian as it possibly gets. Well, fortunately, Justice Morgan ruled that out, and it seems that the Royal Court of Appeal has acknowledged that there are elements within the ruling that are providing sufficient grounds for appeal. And of course, the UCOG application for a similar injunction has been adjourned. And now Quadrilla are seeking to get a similar injunction in place in the courts in Manchester next Thursday. Well, it's all against persons unknown, and who knows what machinations are going on in the background. But I've been contacted by a group that are looking to mount an appeal against this injunction. And I've been asked if you are watching this and you are interested in participating in that opposition to the Quadrilla injunction in any way, then please message me and I will pass your details or your contact information onto the group that is looking to mount this challenge. The bottom line is, if Quadrilla for one moment thought that they were going to be able to go to court next Thursday and simply get a rubber stamp on their injunction, they were, of course, very, very much mistaken. And so now we have INEOS, UCOG and Quadrilla all backed into a corner, knowing that the costs are going to mount exponentially. And, if Quadrilla think that the people on the Fylde Peninsula are simply going to stand on the side of the road and wave placards, which of course is Francis Egan's definition of, well, I'm quite supportive of lawful protest. Well, of course, the industry and the government don't really care about people who stand on the side of the road waving placards. It's no issue for them whatsoever. What they are concerned about is the creativity of communities who come up with ways to cost the industry so much that it makes the operation even less viable than it is anyway. So my email address is ianrcrane@hotmail.com. So if you want to drop me an email or drop me a private message through Facebook. So it's going to be an interesting weekend. I'm certainly going to be continuing to wade through this tome that Quadrilla have posted all around the Filed. And I got to say that one of the most absurd pieces of advice that I've seen is one particular legal company saying, oh, don't tell anyone about the injunction, because then if they do an action, they can deny that they've ever seen the injunction. Well, good luck with that. And actually, you know what? That puts that particular legal advice in the same vein as the industry, not being totally honest, not being upfront, and actually putting people in a position where they are potentially risking their assets or risking their liberty. And you have knowingly, by not sharing that information with them, let them walk into that position. That is totally unacceptable. It's really, really important that people do go into this with their eyes open, understanding what the potential risks are. And it's also important that Quadrilla, INEOS and UCOG understand that there are people in this country who either don't have any assets which to put at risk, and actually are prepared to put their liberty at risk to protect the ecology and protect the future of coming generations. So over the weekend, it's perhaps an opportunity to sit back, to reflect, and decide how much and to what extent we collectively are going to participate in this process. And of course, you know, it's emerging that the unconventional gas opposition, the anti-fracking community, is effectively a nursery, because there are so many other assaults on humanity and on life in the UK in particular, that the corporatocracy and their puppet politicians know that they can only get away with their agenda if there is zero participation from the general public. So this isn't about insurrection, it's not about revolution, it's about establishing a situation where the government understands that the people of the country are not going to simply give them free rein. They will be held to account. And in the not too distant future, if this industry does go ahead, then politicians and people who are in leadership positions in these corporations will find that they are being held to account. And it is their assets and potentially their liberty that will be at risk. So on that note, I'm going to leave you for this week. I'm obviously going to have quite a busy weekend, and I will be back with you on Monday. And once again, congratulations to the crew of the Preston Road Lock-On. 41 hours, I believe, from start to finish. Absolutely superb effort, and a hell of a benchmark that's been set here. But Quadrilla, of course, do need to understand that within the anti-fracking community, we love challenges. And 41 hours, tough one to beat, but I'm sure it will be. So have a great weekend, and I will catch back with you on Monday morning. See you then.